In Tableau 22.2, Tableau wants to tell you stories. There's a new feature that builds a story based on a data visualization inside of your dashboard. And in this video, I'm going to show you how it works and also explain a bit of the history about where this feature comes from. Let's get stuck in. Okay, so we're here on Tableau Online. I'm going to do this feature using web edit. You can do this in desktop, but for this pre-release, I can only really do this via web edit, and I'm recording this before the actual full release just to get ahead of time. So I'm going to do this all entirely through the browser. The other thing to note is that for this feature to work, the data source has to be a published data source. You can't just do it off a data source inside of the workbook. It has to be a published data source. I'm not entirely sure what the restriction there is, but in essence, it could be one of two things. It could be there's a specific bit of architecture behind published data sources that allows Tableau to do this, or it could just be Tableau putting a little bit of weight behind their own data sources to try and encourage people to do things in a much sort of more concise way. So I think it's more of an architecture thing than it is a Tableau trying to dictate how you do your work. But nonetheless, let's hop into one of these sheets and we'll first address the issue of a published data source. I think this workbook is actually got embedded data sources. So let's go ahead and edit this. And the easiest way to do this is just to go to any one of these sheets. And if I go into the sheet, you'll see that I have 3 data sources there. And I can just right click on any one of these, save as a published data source. And because I'm doing this in web edit, this should be almost instantaneous because I'm technically doing it on the server that's running the data source. So when I do that, what I want to do is tick this option here to update this workbook to use the published data source. So it will publish the data source, then it will flip the connections around. And so this connection over here will become a published data source. So let's go ahead and do that. And let's hit publish, hit OK. And what we should immediately see is that the data source updates. And as soon as I do that, you can see that this icon over here on the left-hand side changes to a published data source icon. So that's worked. And that's pretty much good to go. If I can actually do this with everything in the workbook. So let's just go ahead and very quickly do that, just in case anything else comes up. Let's just do the same thing. Let's publish everything. And when I'm doing this, of course, I'm editing this. And there's actually a new feature that saves drafts as we're doing this. So you can see that the draft moniker is over here at the top, and autosave is also on. That's a relatively new feature again in this particular release. So there's 2 things that are happening at the same time in this demo. I've actually had an error in this particular one. I brought in the replacement, select a data source with a published data source. So I think it it did publish it, but it didn't actually switch the data sources over. That's annoying. That's slightly frustrating. So let's try it again and let's see if it works again. And let's call this V2 so it doesn't publish over the previous one. Let's hit V2, publish, success. Same error again. It's not clear why this is. You can copy these error messages and these aren't the most descriptive errors. It might be something to do with the data source type or whatever. So for now, I'll just leave that one in there. Let's try it one more time with this top one. See if this is actually a general bug. As I said before, I am doing this on pre-release software, so I do expect bugs here and there. This one's worked absolutely fine. You can see that's published. So we're just going to ignore anything that uses the sales target in this particular demo because we know that they're not using the published data source. So now that I've done that, I can go back to the overview. I'm still editing my workbook and I can actually start looking at this feature. I'm going to find a scatter plot to start with because I think that's going to be an interesting one to start with because scatter plots are one of those things where they're a chart that when you look at, you can generally see the trends. But what I want to see is what the data story capability is going to add to the ability of reading the chart. Because for a lot of people, the scatter plot, you tend to read it at a very high level. And I want to see if the data stories pulls out any sort of strange trends and outliers inside of this particular data set. So in order to build a data story, there's this new object over here on the bottom left called a data story. And when you drag it in, you can just grab it and drag it in. You can see that I get this option to place it anywhere on the dashboard, like a dashboard item. And when I drop it in, what actually happens is a pop-up appears. Now, I actually tried this earlier on, and I have security settings on my browser, and the browser actually blocked this pop-up from appearing. So if you're trying to do this and nothing's happening, just check that your pop-up blocker isn't blocking this. If it does, what you'll tend to see is something in this very top area here in your browser bar, just saying, look, I've blocked a pop-up. Do you want to allow it? Click on that, hit allow, rerun the action again, and it should open absolutely fine. But it opens up a separate window. The other thing is, depending on your browser and depending how sort of savvy you are or aren't with your browser, what could happen is a scenario like this, where you're working full screen, it's opened up and you think that it's not working, because essentially what happens is the window is actually loaded behind the current active window. So just double check behind your current window to make sure that this window is actually appearing. It should load on top, but again, I've also had one instance where it didn't do that. It disappeared. I went off, did something else, came back and completely forgot where it was, and I thought it was bugged. It was just behind the window. Okay, so now that we've got the data story element here, I'll bring it in right in front of the screen here so we can just focus on setting it up. When you go and drag that item in, the first step is configuring it, and this configuration step takes a bit of time, and I'll come to that point a little later on. But you essentially have to choose the chart that you want it to work on. So for this one, I want the scatter, and once I've done that, I hit next. Then it will ask me about the fields, and for the fields, I can choose the dimensions and all the measures. Now, in this particular case, I've got profit and sales. So I might take the profit ratio out of this, because the profit ratio is where the coloring is happening, and the scatter plot is really just looking at profit and sales. So I'm going to take profit ratio out of this, and I'm going to move it to the ignored area just here at the bottom. You can see this bottom area is the ignored area. And so it's just going to look at customer names, sum of profit and sum of sales. So let's go ahead and have a look at that. So let's hit next. And then the very last step is the story itself. It's saying, okay, what story would you like me to build? And for this one, you can actually see it's loaded a story in the background, but I can actually select a scatter plot in this particular case. And what you want to do is use this particular one for relationships between numerical variables. Now, notice, as soon as I get to this tab, this final story tab just right over here, the visualization actually updates, specifically the text here updates. And so as I cycle through the selection, it's giving me a flavor of what those text is going to look like. It's actually starting to generate the story. You can see it say writing story as I click between these different sections. And so it's using whatever selection you've got here to change the way the story is done. And you can see it's quite verbose. We'll come to that again as well a little later on. So it's really interesting capability. We're just going to choose scatter plot because I think this one has the least text, and I actually want that for this demo. We'll come to that again a little later on. There's lots to unpack with this feature. It's super interesting. So let's hit done, and that's it. We've got our story. Now, what I find a little bit distracting is that this data story is treated as its own object. And I think it actually creates a bit of a burden of work on the author who has to put in a dashboard, because it's not apparent to which visualization. If I deselect the charts on here, if I just go and select this sort of white space, and keep my face here on the bottom right, let's put it on the top right here. If you just look at this dashboard, it's really hard to ascertain what this text is relating to. Is it for the chart at the top, the chart on the left, or the chart on the right? I deliberately placed in the middle to create that confusion, admittedly. Even if I'd place it to one side, the text is going to be interacting with at least two charts, and so it's hard to know exactly what it's looking at. Now, this whole dashboard does look at profit and sales and profit ratio, but again, it's not obvious which analysis it's doing and where, because of course, the narrative will be largely based on dimensions as well as measures in our data sources. And in the scatter plot, the data points relates to customers, which is fine. And on the right, they also relate to customers. So which one of these two charts is it talking about? Well, the way you have to really solve that is, the only way I sort of think design-wise to solve this is to put a container in there. Before I do anything with the container, I'm just going to go ahead and put a border around it. This is not the prettiest solution, but I'm just going to put a yellow border just so it's super clear. And now that I've done that, I'm going to put this inside of it and that inside of it. Okay. What I would have liked potentially is this ability for the story to be this sort of additional information pop-up rather than be a separate object related to the chart. And there's probably going to be a way to do that, but this is why I said earlier on, this creates quite a burden for the author, because what the author now has to do is use the tools that Tableau give you, things like the ability to show and hide containers, buttons, and essentially use all those now features, it used to be hacks, to make this work nicely. And it just makes the feature fall a little bit short in terms of usage. What I would have loved is just for this to be an information icon. You float it next to the title, and when a user hovers over it, the story comes up or clicks away and goes back, rather than this what feels like archaic way of putting text on a dashboard. And that's what it really is. It's quite a lot of text, and it just sort of goes up and down. But let's rechange the balance of this dashboard here. I think these are set to distribute evenly. Let's just double check that that is not the case. Let's do that, and then we can move this around a little bit and give the text a bit more space. Okay, so that's my sort of 2 cents on the initial sort of first impressions. You want to put things in a container, make them the same color so people know that those two things are related, and it's super obvious. Now, once you've put a story into the dashboard, there's this little toolbar at the very, very top. And this is, again, twofold. You can think of this as an author, and you can think of this as a user. We'll come back to what the user sees a little later on towards the end. Once I've created a story, I can go into settings, and I can actually enhance the story a little bit more. Now, what I'm really getting here is fine-grained controls of how the story works. I can make it less wordy or more wordy. I can allow users to change this particular setting. I can actually go into these specific dimension terms and measure labels and change exactly how they're being used. So you'll see that it says sum of profit across all of this. I'm actually just going to use profit. And again, the burden of work here is on the author. I'm having to remove things that are quite straightforward. I would hope it would do this a little bit better. And what that leads to is essentially, I think, a slightly nicer way of reading this. So as profit increased, sales increased based on the data provided. Okay, nice trend. Specifically, when profit increased by 1, sales increased by 1.95. It's basically trying to give like a correlation to this. There may be other factors contributing to sales, but there is evidence of a strong relationship. So increased so basically what it's saying, I just thought about that for 1 second. I thought maybe it should have said this the other way around. So for this particular section, it should have said, when sales are increased by 1.95, sales goes up by a factor of 1. Now that doesn't make as much sense, but basically saying it backwards makes no sense because profit is the end goal. We want to make profit as a business. So it's saying when profit goes up by 1, sales have to double, basically. So to increase profit, there's something about that sentence that just doesn't seem right. But that's because, again, maybe this is machine learning, AI, all that wonderful stuff. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to get out of the uncanny valley that this stuff kind of tends to create. Now, few entities deviated from the general relationship, indicating a good fit. So what it's really talking here is that it's calling the customers entities. So you can go in here and replace this with customers, a customer for 1 and customers for that. And you can add additional terms. So you can say user and users. Okay. And by adding these terms, what you're essentially doing is adding sort of context to the glossary. So as we look at this, few customers deviated from this general relationship, indicating a good fit. The 793 users can be organized into 2 distinct groups of similar profit and sales values. And so what it's doing is it's mixing up its use of these things. I think it's literally alternating its usage throughout the sentences. There were 760 customers that had values of profit. So it's switching different terms. So you might have lots of terms for the same thing. You could use either. I don't like the way it switches them, if that makes sense. I'd rather just refer to them as customers all the way through, and then that's more consistent. But you can see here how this narrative section here, I have a little bit of control as to how the text is formulated. And so this is nice. Now, if we go to the next section, the characteristics, we can open up the characteristics. And what we're really talking about here is formatting, how it's presented to me. Now, when we're talking about profit and sales, these are numerical values. And in this case, I'm dealing in dollars. So I can actually just tell Tableau, look, this is actually a currency we're talking about, and it will format it in the dollar equivalent. And it will deal with dynamic decimal places, and it will format negative values as per the dollars typically formatted. You can assign meaning to large values, so whether they're good, neutral, or bad, and choose how to aggregate profits. So in this case, it's a sum rather than an average. You might have some measures where it makes more sense to do the average. Let's say you're analyzing average price. The total price isn't going to make sense, and therefore you might want to look at the average price rather than the sum price. And again, with sales, we can go ahead and select currency, leave it as a dollar, hit sum. That's absolutely fine, and hit save. And when you hit save, it actually closes that window down for you. And you can start to see we're starting to change how this works. Let's open up the settings again. Again, if you don't see this, sometimes it can disappear into the background. So just make sure you've got it in the foreground. If we go to the analytics tab, we currently don't have analytics for this particular story type for scatter plots. So we'll come back to that another time. Drivers, this is essentially how the data source is perceived by the tool. So source data must be either continuous or discrete. Source data must be either continuous or discrete. So in essence, this particular section is not being driven by anything. When we switch to a different chart type, you'll see this may be working a bit better. Relationships, select measures that have relationships with other measures in your chart. So actual versus benchmark, current versus most versus period. Again, these are just settings to really fine tune everything. The last thing is bullets and paragraphs. So if you select bullets, you get bullet points. If you select paragraphs, what is strange is it seems to me that it just collapses all the text. Again, this could be a formatting thing. We might get sort of spaced that paragraph more properly once the final release is done. And that's sort of the general gist of these particular settings on the left-hand side. A lot of fine-grained control as to how the story is presented. Now, there's one more thing, which is the Edit tab. This Edit tab here allows you to edit this story a little bit more. And this time it's specifically editing what's in front of you. So the settings change how the story is built. The editing changes the story itself. So if we go ahead and select Edit, we get another pane, and this time you can literally edit the story. So the first options you have are the ability to add notes both at the top here and at the bottom. So you can add additional text notes to the story. And then the second thing you can do is you can add some general items. So you can add custom items. Think of these as bits of things that you want to add. So when I clicked on this add custom item, it allows me to add a little sort of text range here. And this is good in the event that maybe you've done your own stories. I've actually got a customer where we add text notes to a report. And this data stories feature might allow me to do that because it will allow maybe the first initial piece of information to come from the visualization and update in real time with the data source, but then allow me to add text notes for more static things that maybe only change quarterly or monthly. And so that will work really, really nicely, just being able to add our own text fields. Now, you can make any of these visible or invisible. You can see the little eye icon over here on the left-hand side, right-hand side even. And when you click on those, you're just showing and hiding specific stories. So now if I hit save, you'll see that if I tick that one there, you'll see that I basically only get one bullet point here. It's just regenerating it. It's not changing the stories. You're just regenerating it. The text and the information is not lost. The analysis stays exactly where it is. Let's add a note here at the top. Add a starting note, and we'll add an ending note. Add an ending note. Hit save, and you'll see those two notes that I've just added come up. Let's add a starting note and add an ending note. I also can't type or spell, but nonetheless, that's it. Let's add a custom note. What I could do is here start typing lorem ipsum dollar. I'm stuck. I ran out of ideas there, so let's just hit save. I managed 3 words of lorem ipsum. I'm sure there's people out there who can do whole paragraphs. And there you go. It comes up as a bullet point as if it was part of the narrative. So this is super interesting. It's really nice to see this here. Now let's try and add a different type of story on another tab to a different chart. Okay, so let's hit save. Let's go ahead and close that. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to build a dashboard. So I want to use this forecasting chart that's included in Superstore Sales. So let's go ahead, create a new dashboard, drag in the forecast. And now that we've dragged in the forecast, so I'm actually going to delete the legend over here on the right-hand side, drag the data story, and we'll go through the process again, this time a little bit faster. So you can see that there's only one chart, forecast. The fields in this particular chart are to do with the months and segment, sales, sum of sales, actually twice there's sales. And I guess there's three sales because what's technically happening is this chart has three segment. So the sales appears three times. Okay. And that's why this is here. It's basically telling me that in sort of a long-winded way. So we'll leave that as is because I mean, technically, it's interesting to see what this does because it's the same measure three times in different contexts. So I think it will have to break things down based on the time perspective, but also the segment as well. So let's leave everything in there as we are. And you can see here that it's suggesting that the continuous is the best fit here. And what is nice about this, if I hit done, you'll see that it actually breaks this down. So you can see here at the top, pivoted summer sales by period, and then the breakdown goes into consumer, then corporate, then home office. So it's actually taking these breakdowns. And at the very, very top, we've got basically the high level summary. And so here you can see there's a summary. It's actually formatted in a slightly different way. If we go back in to edit this, you'll see that you get a little bit more sort of to work with here. So if I just drag this out, you'll see that I actually get now a section for each one. I can actually switch off a section as well as enabling a section. So all of this is fully controllable. You can make this as busy or as light as you want it to be. I'll come back to that in a second. But nonetheless, everything's here that you could want to sort of hopefully modify or change. It starts to feel like a lot of work if you're going to use this to make a really sort of logical thing. And we'll come back to sort of the philosophy of this in a second. But I just want to go back to the settings this time to see what new options we have. If I go to the analytics pane, you can see now we do actually have some capability in here that we can go through. So you can choose analytics to write about in the narrative. You can talk about correlation, and you can obviously look at the breakdowns in the segment. You could look at trend line analysis, and you're basically setting these thresholds for different types of behaviors and when it should talk about them or when it shouldn't. Okay. And this is again giving you fine-grained control of how this works. The other thing you can do is if I go back to the drivers, you can see that previously we didn't have any metric or dimension drivers. Now we do have some dimensional drivers, and select the type of driver that has the greatest impact on your analysis, whether it's the individual count, the percentage change, or the cumulative percentage if there's sort of a long view of something. And again, you can have a click between these, and you're basically changing these particular factors. And so that to me feels like you really actually have to know your data very well as an author in order to do this. And what makes me what is interesting about this is that I feel like out of the box, this is a very hands-on feature. This to me doesn't feel like an easy to use out of the box experience, because I think as an author, I now have to spend more time first understanding the story it's telling me, then figuring out whether I think my users are going to appreciate the story or not, and then make changes to either get them closer to understanding the story or deciding that there's too many changes to make and then just wholesale removing it. I think in reality, that's actually what will happen. People will have a go at this, won't understand how it works. We'll look at this video, we'll look at other sort of demos, we'll look at all these settings they have to go through, and they'll go, well, this was supposed to make my life easier, but it's now introduced 6 tabs that I now have to manage that just give a summary of my data. Now, when it comes to the stories themselves, I actually also think these are quite difficult to fine tune and understand. And it's just quite a text heavy experience. I was really hoping for something that would be quite high level and aggregated. For example, sales were up by 2%. Show me the chart to show that. The values have gone from this to this, which is 67% from this to this. I can actually see this text over here. And it's weird because, Tableau's always been a visualization tool, but it just seems like in this feature, we've sort of taken a step back and we've given people text, and it takes up so much valuable real estate. And it's a dashboard item, which means people have to decide whether or not to include it in their work. Whereas if it's something like explain data or ask data where it's part of a sidebar, that makes some more sense to me because it's then part of the Chrome and users can take it or leave it as and when they wish. And so I think this would have been a feature that was better as part of the Chrome rather than as part of the dashboard. By Chrome, I mean the interface, Tableau itself, the sidebars, the panes, the pop-ups, the things that Tableau do for you as a vendor to make it easy for the user to understand what you're looking at, rather than something that you as an author have to embed into your workbook, then figure out how to space it, then format it. All of that work just takes so much time. Okay. And yeah, there's just a lot to really understand here. So I'm sure as we use this, as it gets enhanced over time, we'll start to get a better understanding of how exactly it works. But my general feeling on this, it's like 50-50. This is nice, but again, I'm going to be intrigued to see whether this really gets used or whether it's going to still have low usage, and whether this might then end up being pivoted by Tableau to do something else to explain dashboards. Now, there is a flip side to this, and it's quite a positive one actually. And that is when it comes to accessibility, because what this tool is doing is essentially creating what I'd consider to be the closed captioned version of the dashboard. It's literally taking the sheet and explaining what's going on in the chart. And for people who are visually impaired, this actually might be a great assistive tool to start to make it easy to understand what's going on in the visualization. Imagine an experience where this technology was being used to describe what was going on in a dashboard or in a chart. That would be so useful, just based on click interactions or any other sort of selection interactions that someone would use. It would then sort of enable this feature, run this feature, and then get it to tell a story of what's happening with the data. In order to do that, I think it would have to be a lot less sort of verbose than this. But if it could sort of improve the way it sort of highlights importance of things, then I think that would work really, really well. So for example, the top segment breakdowns here, this is done really nicely. The 3 series did not all move in a similar direction from December 2019 to November 2019, with summer sales 2 falling the most, 5.09%, and summer sales 1 having the same starting and ending values, and summer sales 2 finished trending upward in the final period. What it's really talking about is the 3 different sales values for consumer, corporate, and home office. So data stories, it's a nice feature. It's good to have. This was one of the keynote sort of spectacular features. This I think is the headline feature of 2022.2. But again, I think a part of me wonders whether this is a good example of Tableau just losing its heritage a little bit. And, you know, as an author, it disappoints me that this gets, prominence over something as simple as, conditional formatting inside of calculations. We still have to do nasty hacks for that. It frustrates me that this gets sort of precedence over improved chart types for certain things. For example, up and down indicators, just native as part of the product, rather than us having to go around, find shapes, write calculations to do all of this. The kind of stuff that makes it easy for me as an author to do this just isn't easy. For me to do this same thing in a better way using visuals just doesn't exist. And instead we've got this sort of text-based feature. So maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I'm just, not the actual sort of model used for this feature, but I don't know. It just doesn't land with me very well. It's an impressive feature, don't get me wrong, but I think it's got a bit of work and improvement to really find its place. Okay, so it's now time to take a look and see what it looks like to the end user. What I've done is obviously created 2 stories. The first one we're going to go to is the last one we looked at, which is this one on dashboard number 7, where we added the story to the right-hand side of the forecast chart. When you go through to it, it obviously loads the story, and this is what you get. This is obviously a very text-heavy story. So you get this basically a simple text box. You can just highlight everything. Now, what I like about this is that there is this sort of interface click. It's sort of not obvious. It's this sort of blue highlighter that wasn't as obvious when we were looking at the dashboard item, but actually it's a link. And when you click on it, it goes into a deeper version of the story with a bit of a navigation. So you can sort of click in and click out. And again, when you go down here, you can see that consumer has its own click-in capability, and you can go in and get a little bit more depth when you click into those. So there's even navigation into this, and it just makes it, like I said before, quite a text-heavy setup. Now, there is a setting that allows you to control how much text shows up and lets the user choose how much text shows up. If we go back to the general dashboards, back when I created the scatter plot, I actually enabled an option around verbosity, which is now going to show up when I load this story. So let's wait for this story to load. And you can see here that I have this control here that gives me low, medium, and high verbosity. If I just go to the other end of the extreme, select high, you can see that the text is a little bit longer. Now, again, I think this is a sign of lacking confidence. In any typical piece of text, you'd normally say to someone that you don't need more words, you just need better words, right, to get a point across. That's why Twitter is such a wonderful platform, because it forces you in this constraint not to have more words, but to have better words in the same amount of space. And I feel like this verbosity thing is a little bit of a get out of jail free card, part of the feature set that allows the user to sort of dial up and down how much more text they want to have. And to me, surely there's just the right amount of text for the thing you're trying to explain. And there shouldn't be any need to choose how many more words you want to see, because it should just tell you what you need to know out the gate without any need to dial that up or down. If it's useful, it's useful, and if it's not, it shouldn't be there. So that verbosity thing is a bit of another weird thing to sort of bear in mind. Now, the other thing I sort of think is actually quite important is this copy button. Now, this copy button sort of gave me mixed feelings. The first one, as an author, something crossed my mind and just thought, well, wait, how does an end user know that I, as the author, didn't come up with this? There's nothing here that says this text has been generated by Tableau data stories. Something to let you know that this is machine talking and not a human being who's actually crafted this analysis. I think that's actually an important distinction, because if you copy this, you might then go and paste that information somewhere else. And the fact that copy button even exists, that's been such a ideological sticking point in the Tableau world, which is letting people export your data. And for a long time, we've always sort of fought this battle of telling people, no, don't export your data to this platform. Just go ahead and create a better experience so people stay in the Tableau ecosystem. And that's been the sort of champion approach to this way of thinking. But now suddenly there's a massive copy button that just gives you this information for free, with no heritage as to where it goes. I mean, I could go and paste this in a Word document and off I go. And there's no sort of context. I mean, if I just open up a notepad, let me just open up a notepad here. Let's just paste it. Let's open this up and open this notepad here, and we'll just drop this in. We'll call this text and just see the raw text that it pastes. So if I can't even type, it's so late. So if I put a new word, let's do that. This is what it pastes. It doesn't paste anything that says, oh, this has come from Tableau's, machine learning wizardry. It's just text. And so now this text can go into any Word document. And the key question I ask you is, if you paste this in a Word document or a PowerPoint, now how do you communicate to someone where this came from? It's just a little bit difficult. Maybe again, I'm being a little bit backwards here. Maybe I'm just overthinking this, and I'm supposed to sort of approach this with a little bit more of a liberal approach. But I really struggle, because Tableau, this is the same company that is, given me this sort of permission model in the same product, by the way. To get to the same chart, I have this incredibly sort of detailed permission model for content. And on the other side, I'm just getting copy and paste for free. So again, it's a little bit of an interesting one. I think I'd be really interested to see how this evolves over time. I'd actually be interested to see how things like permissions sort of interact with this. Can you disable whether that shows or not through the permissions model or something like that? It'd be just really interesting to sort of find out more bit about that. But nonetheless, that's how it looks like to the end user. Now, I said earlier on in the video that I'd talk to you a bit about where this feature comes from. And this is another great example of a recent purchase that Tableau have pivoted into a feature. So Tableau back in 2021, in fact, this post was by Mark Nelson. At the time, he wasn't president and CEO, but it was a feature that was bought by essentially acquiring Narrative Science. Now, Narrative Science had built this capability both on desktop and on mobile. Essentially, this let's see if we can open a screenshot of this a little bit bigger. So you can see here that essentially it was connecting to data sources, and it was actually building some of these nice visuals I'm actually talking about getting as a user. These simple big ass numbers, as they call them, and nice indicators telling you the trend of the data, just making that kind of stuff really easy. Nice summarized stories with up and down indicators in the text. This feels like a much, much more watered down version of that, and none of this sort of greatness has made it all the way in here. I never used this feature well enough, but I always remember being quite impressed. And at the time, I gave the same critique that I gave today, which was this is great, but make it easy for me to build charts and I will help serve my users better. And so this is where this feature comes from. It's really interesting to see this now as a headline feature. And we've seen this with Ask Data in the past. We've seen this with a bunch of other tools actually over time. Either Tableau have copied them wholesale, taken the ideas on board and enhanced them and done them better, or they've just gone out and acquired a company that's doing that thing already and then brought it into the fold. And that's what, let's see how many year turnaround of this. So this was 2021, December of 2021. And here we are almost not quite a year later, but 6 months later. We have the sort of end product that's been rolled into the feature. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting to see that kind of quick turnaround. But again, as I said before, um, this feels like a feature that's moving away from Tableau's heritage to me. Tableau's heritage is about seeing and understanding data, not creating text boxes that tell you about your data, if that makes sense. So that's a pretty long one. It's late over here as well. So I've been sort of ranting and talking for a really long time. Let me know what you think. I'd really love to know your opinions about this feature. Am I being too harsh? Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? Do you think there could be a better job with this feature? Are you going to take the time to create space on your dashboard for this feature? That's the true test. Are you going to give valuable pixel space to this feature? And if so, let me know why. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.